What if I told you that one of the most extraordinary acts of faith in history took place under the shadow of arrows, in the heat of battle? Imagine standing alone, your body pierced by 3 arrows, yet your heart and soul are so immersed in prayer that not even the pain can break your devotion. This is not just any story. It's the untold story of Abad bin Bishr, a Sahabi-e-Rasul, a companion of the Messenger of Allah, whose love for the Quran and sacrifice for God became a timeless symbol of courage and faith. It's a story you've hardly heard before, one that will transform the way you see devotion, sacrifice, and the true meaning of belief. Stay with us to discover the heroic journey of a man whose legacy continues to inspire the world. It was the 4th year after the Hijrah, and the city of the Prophet Muhammad, Medina, faced threats from both within and without. Within the city, the influential Banu an-Nadir, a Jewish tribe, broke their agreement with the Prophet and made plans to assassinate him. As punishment, they were banished from Medina. This event occurred in the 2nd month. For the next 2 months, a tense quiet settled over the city. But then, the Prophet Muhammad received disturbing news. Tribes from distant Najd were planning to attack. To preempt them, the Prophet gathered a force of over 400 men. He left his companion Uthman bin Affan in charge of Medina and set out eastward. Among those who joined the expedition was the young and devout Abad bin Bishr. Upon arriving in Najd, the Prophet and his companions were surprised to find the villages deserted. Only women and children remained. The men of the tribes had fled to the hills, preparing for battle. As the time for afternoon prayer arrived, the Prophet feared the hostile tribesmen might attack during the prayer. To mitigate this, the Prophet arranged the Muslims in ranks and divided them into 2 groups. One group would stand guard, while the other performed the prayer. The 2 groups would switch places after 1 rak'ah, completing the prayer as the prayer of fear. This tactical prayer allowed the Muslims to stay alert while continuing their worship. Seeing the disciplined ranks of the Muslims, the hostile tribesmen were filled with unease and fear. The Prophet's presence and the disciplined prayer gave the impression of strength, unity, and determination. The tribesmen backed down, and the Prophet and his companions were able to leave Najd without any bloodshed, sending a clear message about the strength of the Muslim community. On the way back to Medina, the Prophet and his companions camped for the night in a valley. Once the Muslims had settled their camel mounts, the Prophet asked, "Who will guard us tonight?" Abad and his companion, Ammar bin Yasir, volunteered without hesitation. The Prophet had paired Abad and Ammar as brothers after the Hijrah, and now they took up their positions at the mouth of the valley. Abad noticed Ammar was tired and asked, "Which part of the night would you prefer to sleep, the first or the second?" Ammar, weary from the journey, chose to sleep during the first part of the night. Abad agreed and remained awake. As Ammar fell asleep, Abad stood alone in the stillness of the night, feeling a serene sense of calm. The stars above, the trees, and the rocks all seemed to be in quiet worship of their Creator. There was no sign of danger, and so Abad chose to spend his time in worship and reciting the Quran. Abad had been enchanted by the Quran ever since he first heard it recited by the beautiful voice of Musab bin Umair, before the Hijrah. From that moment, the Quran had become a constant in his life, and he had memorized many surahs by heart. He became known among the Prophet's companions as the friend of the Quran. One night, the Prophet Muhammad was praying in the house of Aisha, which adjoined the mosque in Medina. He heard a beautiful, sweet voice reciting the Quran. He asked, "Aisha, is that the voice of Abate?" Aisha replied, "Yes, O Messenger of God." The Prophet then prayed, "O Lord, forgive him." So, in the stillness of that night in Najad, Abad stood facing the Qibla, raising his hands in surrender to God. As he recited Surah Al-Kahf, a surah of 110 verses dealing with the virtues of faith, truth, patience, and the relativity of time, his voice filled the night with a sense of peace and devotion. While Abad was absorbed in his prayer, a stranger stalked at the outskirts of the valley. This man had once been part of a plot to attack the Prophet Muhammad, but he had fled into the hills when the Muslims arrived. Now he was seeking revenge for the capture of his wife, who had been taken as a hostage by the Muslims. The man had sworn to Allat and Al-Uzza that he would not return without shedding blood. He noticed the figure of Abad silhouetted in the night at the mouth of the valley, and realized that the Prophet and his followers must be inside. Without a sound, he drew his bow and aimed an arrow at Abad. The first arrow struck Abad in his flesh. Calmly, Abad removed the arrow and continued with his recitation, unshaken in his devotion. The attacker shot again. This time, the second arrow found its mark. Abad pulled out the second arrow and carried on as though nothing had happened. Then came the third arrow, which also struck Abad. Still, Abad did not interrupt his recitation. He finished his prayer, made ruku and sujud, and in his weakened state stretched his right hand to wake Ammar, who had been sleeping nearby. Ammar woke up to see Abad, his body covered in blood. "Get up, Ammar, and stand guard in my place. I have been wounded," Abad said. Ammar jumped up shouting, and seeing the two of them, the attacker fled into the darkness. Ammar, in shock, asked Abad, "Ya Subhanallah, why didn't you wake me when you were hit by the first arrow?" Abad responded with unwavering faith, "I was in the middle of reciting verses from the Quran that filled my heart with such awe. I did not want to cut short the recitation. The Prophet had asked me to memorize this surah. Death would have been dearer to me than to interrupt my recitation of it." Abad's response revealed the depth of his devotion to the Quran, to his faith, and to the Prophet. He was known for his constant immersion in worship, his courage in battle, and his selflessness in the path of God. When the time came for sacrifice, Abad was always at the front lines, and when it was time for rewards, he could only be found after great effort, never seeking glory for himself. Aisha once said, "There are three among the Ansar who no one could excel in virtue: Sa'd bin Mu'ad, Usaid bin Qudayr, and Abad bin Bishr." Abad met his fate at the Battle of Yamama, where he fought valiantly until the end. Just before the battle, he sensed the division between the Muhajirin and Ansar, and knew that for the Muslims to succeed, they must be united. He gathered the Ansar and said, "O Ansar, distinguish yourselves among men, destroy your scabbards, and do not forsake Islam." He led an offensive into the enemy ranks, driving them back into what came to be known as the Garden of Death. But at the walls of this garden, Abad fell. His body was so badly wounded that it was hardly recognizable. He had lived, fought, and died as a believer.